So continuing on with the second part of the 8th lecture series where we look more project management principles. So a project, sort of the definition of it here is that it's just a temporary group activity, so that's intended to deliver some product, service, or result. There are the sort of concrete things, artifacts, I guess if you would say, that are created by a product are usually called deliverables or outputs. And what's important here is that if you think about an organization as undertaking the coordination and control of ongoing activity, a project is basically a temporary organization that goes through a single cycle, for example, of some specific set of deliverables. Um, so these are some examples then of what project management tends to look like. It's a pretty big deal, especially in areas where you have very clear contract deliverables. So at the Department of Transportation, for example, you tend to have these flow charts that will look like this, where you go through, okay, here's where we get the design, here's where we get so there's like an approval process. At the end of it, you sort of get some sort of approval. Then there's some design process. At the end of it, you get some design plan. Then you have construction, and you again get set up, usually a set of deliverables along the way, but you have some final milestone. And then you close out a project, for example. So the links here, you can go and see more about this. But this would be an example of, say, building a highway or building like the newest intersection, like the new roundabout that we have here in Amherst. These projects are usually, project management principles are used to manage the temporary project that has this end result of some sort of a deliverable. But again, what you can see is that even along the way, there are deliverables like the approvals document or the design document. The Federal Highway Administration here in the U.S. has much the same type of process here. You can see there's like design build versus just the design itself. So in a design build, you actually have construction is done by the same people who do the design, whereas the design bid build, whereas if you've got the design and the build separate, it's going to look differently. So again, you can see here that these are processes that are a project is sort of a one-time episode or process that has these milestones along the way, and you can break down the overall work process into discrete functions that sort of have a discrete deliverable at the end. Interestingly, so as I said before, project management, especially really starting as in the 1990s, probably here in the U.S., but with things like the reinventing government was sort of like under Clinton was one of these basically attempts to sort of bring more project management principles into governance. In the UK under, I'm trying to think, there was a lot of this under Blair, but even now under conservatives, there's the implementation unit. So basically the idea of bringing sort of project management principles that treat, instead of having ongoing work processes, but that treat many governance problems as projects like, have been brought in into governance. So here, this is the project delivery in Oregon. And so the idea of you start with different types of planning or program development, then you go through the you actually do the designing, then you award some contract, and then you actually sort of manage or implement, and you transition to maintenance. So again, this is about construction, but the same principles are being used in other areas of governance. And what you can see is this looks very much like the implementation cycles or the problem-solving cycles. So in essence, you could think of project management as a sort of more concrete example of some of these, when we looked at the transition week of a problem-solving cycle, because you tend to typically have some sort of a design, then you have some sort of an implementation phase or realization design. So here's deliverology, which is the UK term for the public sector ideas of deliverology, that again, you can see that this looks very similar. So you start off with a clear goal of what success looks like. You're then going to be very clear about accountabilities and metrics. So this starts to look a lot like performance management, right? We're starting to basically say, we're going to set these milestones Some of which may be concrete deliverables. Other ones might just simply be performance goals. So 85% on time mail, or only, 2% of all mail is lost, or, some sort of a decline in error rate, or an increase in workplace safety as measured by a reduced number of workplace accidents. Um, these goals need to be realistic and supported appropriately by the budgeting. So what this means is that if you want to have an error-free, for example, FAA, and you're tracking number of FAA incidents, you don't want to create a budget that doesn't give you enough people to actually be watching the planes and have like second sets of eyes, because that would be a design that would be likely to fail. Then what you need to have is some way of actually reporting this, tracking the performance and reporting it back to management, so that management can keep basically apprised of when, so management information systems are often quite important because you need to know when things are falling short of the desired goals, so that basically managers can then engage directly with failure or falling short of goals. And it needs to be somewhat robust. Now, whenever in this sort of idea of having robust dialogues, part of the idea is that in some cases, what you need to find out is you don't want your employees telling you things are succeeding when they're really failing. You actually want to often create incentives to let you know whenever they need additional help, because sometimes a failure to meet certain goals can be the result of things that are actually beyond your employees' control, and so it needs management intervention to be successful. And then again, you want to have this accountability by making sure that there are good consequences for good and bad performance, but again, with this caveat of making sure that the conditions allow the employees to succeed. So the idea is this is a very different approach to management, right? So this is sort of combining, if you will, a carrot and a stick. But again, a lot of it rests on the idea that you can set these concrete goals and then constantly be measuring progress against them. And this is one of the big core ideas behind the sort of deliverology or implementation or project management type principles as they're brought to governance. So just a bit of background then here on project management is that as early as we started the study of management, the idea of Gantt charts, which are used to track project management, they basically use some of the principles that we were using in the enterprise weeks, swim lanes and timelines, etc. But these ideas were part of the earliest work done in the scientific management process, which eventually became more of what we now think of as something like industrial engineering. By the 1950s, a lot of the military in particular were really trying to use some of these principles to do a better job of scientifically improving performance on all sorts of military issues, but also in terms of major construction. So there started to be things like the critical path method. Basically, the idea was that you didn't want to get, as you were going along and you're building a building, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, the part that we need, before we can go to the next step. So we can't basically cover the walls, put in the floors, do anything until our electricity's been installed. But whoops, we forgot to hire an electrician, or the one that we got just got sick and they don't have all their parts here. So the idea that you need to know basically what's critical path. So what things have to get done before the next thing can get done. And those have to be managed more carefully almost than anything. And also there's this idea of program evaluation. So these are the review techniques we were just talking about for how you get feedback and basically put in point what eventually became continuous improvement or continuous quality management principles. So again, what you can see then is by the 1980s, these idea of business process reengineering, again, very tightly linked to some of the work we've done on, say, identifying clogs and that type of redesign, industrial engineering. So business process reengineering and, again, this idea of total quality management became really quite big in the 1980s and 1990s. People started going to Japan to study Kaizen and other ways that the Japanese were quite effective at managing their human resources. It's interesting that even though we've looked at so many examples where automation or sort of creating some sort of a management information system became quite important to solving problems, even as early as 1990, Michael Hammer was writing this book, obliterate, don't just automate it. What he, of course, meant by that was with the junta, you don't want to just put the process right onto the computer. You also want to rethink the whole process and see whether or not you can improve it, which, as we saw, there weren't major improvements needed in Junta. There were actually sort of minor tweaks, but they were quite important. The automation itself didn't solve all the problems. Part of it was the actual re-engineering of the process. So what that has sort of meant then is, again, you get these delivery units, this reinventing government, the ideas of performance management, which is tightly linked to the idea of contracts, service agreements, and project management, or project management principles, have become deeply embedded in everyday governance. At least there were attempts to do it at the high level. Now, what can get difficult, of course, is that when you're talking about something like U.S. government, there is not enough centralization that many of the people say in local town governments might not have had the same type of exposure and training. So to contrast this, there's something called Prince, and I guess it's now Prince 2, I think, in the UK, where all public government employees are actually trained in Prince, which is a project management software. In order to work in the government, you have to have had training in this. So that project management principles have become much more deeply embedded in the UK, in fact, than they really have in the US. So I've said over and over again project management principles, and now I'm going to be a bit more clear about what that means. Basically, project management is a management technique that involves planning, so we know that's always big in management, organizing and monitoring and allocating resources to achieve project goals. So again, the big idea is you're allocating different resources to different functional tasks. So you have to get the correct functional breakdown of tasks. You need to monitor it. You need to allocate the resources. And again, you're monitoring vis-a-vis these goals. And usually you're doing things like setting project timelines, using resource allocation software where you say, I've got this many people, this person's going to be doing this on this day, and you make sure that you don't have people overcommitted or undercommitted, that the load on them is balanced. So again, you're trying to avoid these sort of demand and supply issues with terms of workload. You're setting milestones so you can monitor performance. You're identifying critical path, so you're making sure that, basically you don't finish building a parking lot, but you don't yet then have the permits, right? So you can't get the construction company basically there before you've got the permitting process done. So you need to make sure those things all fall in the correct timeline. So this is an example of tracking a Gantt chart that tracks a project timeline here on the bottom, but you can see that sometimes people will actually use these sort of post-it note type approaches, especially when they're building it up initially. I mentioned before, there's some very fancy and often expensive software, depending on what you're using, that can help with project management as you're trying to do very large, complex projects. But I think almost anything, if you think about it, planning a wedding could be broken down, used as a project management type problem. Obviously, building large highways or building a large building, clearly project management. But really anything at any scale can be designed this way using these different principles. So again, part of the idea, though, that's really intrinsic to it is that you can in some way track your progress. Now, in the case of a concrete deliverable like a new highway, clearly you could have things like, okay, we've now dug out all the road area that we need, and now we've set the leveler down there, and now we've actually poured the concrete, and now we're putting the lines on the concrete. But what about things like education or welfare? How do you start to track progress on this? So we talked about this some, for example, in the Brazilian health case, where we thought, okay, well, how about we look number of children that get vaccinated, or the number of children that have access to some sort of primary well child or sort of primary care. With education, we might get things like graduation rates or standardized test scores. Now, of course, the problem here, which is probably most familiar to all of you with test scores, is that in essence, it very well may be that, the thing to the extent that the thing that you're trying to achieve with your program, the sort of desired outputs, and particularly when you get onto things, so it's much easier when you're tracking desired outputs. As you move on to desired impacts and trying to track that, you can end up with people basically trying to hit the target but miss the point. So you can have people really focused on standardized test scores but forget about the goal is to improve learning. So there are some issues involved, but in theory, the idea is that with tracking progress, when you're not dealing with concrete deliverables, you might still have measures of the desired program outcomes much easier, or it can get quite fuzzy when you move on to desired program impacts. So another big important point of dealing with project management principles is actually managing the resources. So this is an example of you have these different employees, and you can see when they're busy and when they're overbooked. So this is just, again, an example from, this is a Project Net software package of how resource management will often work in project management software. So what are the big differences between what you're doing as a daily manager versus a project manager? Part of it is that project management is a temporary group as opposed to a more permanent group. So the types of control and coordination techniques you can use are quite different. Obviously, to some extent, you're always dealing with dotted line or cross-functional organizations when you're dealing with projects. So you're always dealing with indirect authority most of the time as a project manager, which is one of the reasons that it becomes much more effective to do things like performance manage than to try to use other like direct control or just rely completely on professional norms. What's nice, though, is that all the conditions should be right for this in project management because you should have clear and limited performance goals and the clear scope of work and resource constraints. So when you get into ambiguous performance goals or unconstrained resource allocations, their daily management is needed because it's a much less clear-cut process. So really, project management can only work really under these conditions where you have clear performance goals and clear scope of work, which is part of what can make some of the ways that project management has been implemented in local government and national government also a little bit problematic because those conditions don't always apply. So you can think for just a moment, if you want to pause the tape, about the examples we might have seen of different project management principles in use in prior cases. One of the things that you might recognize is that a lot of the cases where there's some sort of an episode or an implementation, they often will rely on project management principles to a greater or lesser extent.